Welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. I'm watching as many of you are trickling in. My name is Amy Roan, and I'm the administrator of the Office of Special Education at the Nebraska Department of Education. And we want to welcome you to our final of 5 in our Summer SEL series brought to you by the Nebraska NeMTSS team. We've had 4 other amazing webinar presentations that can all be located on LaunchNE.com. If you hover over each of the individual tiles, the information will pop up with the recorded webinar as well as the materials that go along with it. So we encourage you, if you are just joining us for the first time, to go check out 1 through 4 and get ready for today as we do trauma-informed care and restorative practice. I'm excited to introduce Casey and Laura from our Nebraska NeMTSS team, who will be your wonderful hosts for today. So take it away, Casey and Laura.
All right, thanks, Amy. We are excited to be with you today as we've had several of these sessions, and Casey and I have both been on other ones, and we're excited to wrap it up. There's been a lot of information shared, and we have a lot of what we think is great information to share with you tonight. So we're excited for you guys to learn a little bit more about trauma-informed care, restorative practices. We know that everybody's at a different place with this, so we feel that you'll be able to take something away to be able to take back for your practice this fall. Introductions. I'm Laura Barrett. I am the co-coordinator for Nebraska NeMTSS. I am based out in the western part of the state, but I get to work with the whole state.
And I am Casey Herner. I am the Regional 3 lead for Nebraska NeMTSS, so I specifically work with ESUs 1, 7, and 8, but I also collaborate with the whole NeMTSS team, so we can kind of work throughout the entire state together.
All right. So these are our learning objectives that we hope at the end of the time you'll feel we've accomplished these. So in this past month, you've joined us for sessions and we've talked about adults SEL, we've talked about professional culture, SEL competencies, educator self-care, responsive practices, and our family partnerships. So today's going to kind of bring us back to our why. As we brought together this series, we really wanted to bring it to these trauma-informed approaches and how we can create an environment within our school as our students are coming back. Our staff and our students, as they come back to school after this pandemic, they're going to experience some trauma through this time frame, and it looks different for everybody. And we think it's important that we recognize and look for ways to adjust our practices intentionally. So as students come back for reentry, we're able to have environments that are safe for both our students and our staff. So we're going to start, and Casey's going to kick us off talking a little bit about trauma.
Yes, so before we begin understanding why it is essential to be aware of the impacts of trauma, we need to first break down what trauma is. It is certainly a multifaceted definition, which is why it is difficult to use a definition just from one source. So the definition that's on the screen is a combination from the American Psychological Association, the Substance Abuse for Mental Health Services Administration, as well as a book called The Heart of Trauma, written by Bonnie Bandonak. So in combination, they define trauma as results from physical or emotional event, series of events, or a set of harmful circumstances leading to a response of fear and or pain that does not have the support it needs to be digested and integrated into the flow of our developing brains, having lasting adverse effects on an individual. A really important piece here is the traumatic response being due to not having the support needed at a given time. So in a little bit, we will dig into a little bit further what the difference between that potential or the embedded trauma is. But first, we need to explore the types of trauma that an individual might experience. So the different types of trauma, there are direct and indirect trauma. Direct trauma is any traumatic event that occurs directly to someone. And the indirect trauma then is being affected by content or visuals of another living creature suffering. So seeing somebody else going through trauma is then the indirect trauma. The latter, the indirect Trauma is quite common for individuals that work in high stress and trauma exposed fields. As we know, education can certainly be included as one of those fields, which is why it isn't critical to understand trauma in students and adults alike. And that way we're able to ensure there's a positive climate for them to foster social, emotional, and behavioral well-being to each other. So from teacher to teacher, from staff to staff, from teacher to student, from student to student. So within that, there's also vicarious traumatization, which occurs in helping professionals when they work with individuals who have experienced trauma. For example, helpers notice that their fundamental beliefs about the world are actually altered and possibly damaged by being repeatedly exposed to traumatic material. So, for example, a school mental health practitioner may stop being able to believe that any relationship can be healthy due to the nature of their work with students coming from abusive homes. And so that's just one example that might happen in an educational system. Then the other type of indirect stress is secondary traumatic stress, which seeks to understand why service providers might exhibit symptoms similar to PTSD without having necessarily been exposed to that direct trauma themselves. With that being said, these can be acute or from a single incident, or they can be chronic from repeated and prolonged incidences, or complex, which is actually the exposure to multiple traumatic events. So as you can see, there are just so many different ways for individuals to be impacted by trauma. But that's why it's so important for us to be cognizant and aware of what trauma is and the types. So next, Laura will explain some possible causes. You're on mute.
Thanks. There's a thunderstorm going on outside my house, so I'm trying to mute it so you don't hear the thunder in the background and interrupting Casey and that. So I apologize for that. So on the screen, you will see some possible causes for trauma. And so as you look through this list, maltreatment, assault, violence, loss, war, refugees, all of this list might make you a little bit uncomfortable. And honestly, it might trigger some emotions for you. And that is absolutely normal. And what we have to realize is these things right here are real and they impact our students, but they also impact us as adults. And so Casey just talked on the previous slide about the different types of trauma that might happen, but we have to know that these lived experiences that our adults and our students have are what are happening in their world. So right now I want you guys to look at this list and I'm going to ask for some audience participation. I see there's several of you out there. What are some things, some traumatic situations or causes of trauma that you have seen for students in your school? And put those in the chat box. Do we have the chat box? Yes, put those in the chat, please. Any other ones that you see? Abusive home environment, loss of a parent, absolutely. Poverty, very big in a lot of our communities. Rape, murders, watching their own parents die, experiences, they've been there. Moving, changing home placement, loss of a peer, parents changing jobs, drugs, drug use of the student, drug use of their family, things that they're in there, sexual assault, a whole variety of trauma experiences. And so what I want you to think about is, friend suicide, the things that we have going on in our world. We have to be aware of these and we have to be aware of the trauma that is happening inside our life, because if we can't recognize that it's happening, it's hard for us to be able to build in those tools and supports so that we can move forward in that. So, oops, I moved too fast. There we go. We're going to talk about two different types of trauma. So all of those situations that we saw on the previous slide, all of those happen very regularly in our world, and a lot more regularly than we would like to have any of that happen. But what we want to talk about is not every single one of those events that we talked about causes long-term trauma for a situation, for a student. So the origin of that trauma has more to do with the environment and the support system than the actual event itself. So how many of those events have you experienced? And I'm not going to ask you to share that out, but I'd like you to think through that. But what did you have around you? What support systems that you have? This pandemic that we're living in right now is a potential trauma. It's something that's there at that event and what's going on in the world. However, when we look at embedded trauma, that's what happens when the event happens and there are not supports provided during that trauma. So it could be that this child was feeling alone, the adult was feeling alone, they didn't have someone with them during this whole time frame. Their parent was an essential worker and they were not home to be there with them. Or somebody was sick and they couldn't go be with that person. They couldn't go be with grandma in the hospital because grandma was there and no visitors can come into the hospital, and then grandma died. What happens in that situation? Any of those causes can lead to that embedded trauma that it's a longer term piece because of those supports. So what I want you to think about as we're coming back is, how have our students been supported during this time? Well, they maybe have embedded trauma because of this, but really thinking about, what about our staff members who were trying to juggle being a parent and teaching their kids while they were also learning how to do an environment of online learning. They're stressed of that. Now they're coming back into it and trying to figure out what it means again. How do we help do this? Because recognizing what they experienced, and we experience the same event, we may have different levels of trauma with that same event because of the supports in our lives. And so even though we've all been through this exact same pandemic across the country, it's very different for each individual person. So we want to make sure we realize that some might need more support than others. So Casey's going to dive into a little bit of the science of this here. So it's your turn, Casey.
Unmute, yes. So yes, as Laura was explaining, trauma has so much more to do with the interpersonal environment than actually the event itself. So the way in which trauma remains with individuals, however, it has everything to do with relational neuroscience. This actually describes human development and functioning as being a product of the relationship between the mind and the body and the relationships themselves. So our brains are inherently social. So we want to be social human beings. So with relationships through emotional communication that supports a sense of safety and security. So that is just telling us that our relationships are so important, because that's how humans feel safe. That's how every living thing feels safe and secure, is through a relationship of some sort. So we should look to the science behind these fundamental relationships in our lives, because this is just how our brain absorbs our experiences. They shape the neural connections, and that's how the brain actually learns things, is through these neural connections. So the impact of trauma can leave the devastating effects on individuals. As you'll see on the following slide, these neural pathways are the interactive roads to connect all human systems together. So as you see on this slide, there's just all the different things from eyes to ears, the vocal cords, the belly brain, the heart brain, the brain stem, midbrain, skin, muscles. So it's really just important to consider the ways in which all of these neural systems are actually interacting, because they cross paths all the time. Which also detects, interprets, choreographs, and archives our experiences. So everything that's happened in our lives, there's just all connected together. So some things to consider: for example, our skin is our external nervous system. So minimal, so not having hardly any touch or painful touch, can be very, very traumatic to people. This most likely will continue to impact students upon return from the pandemic. So as Laura was discussing, like, it can be different types of trauma coming in. So if students have had lack of socialization, or if they've been quarantined and they haven't had that human contact, how is that going to impact them, and what type of trauma might that bring when they come back from and they resume school? And then the next thing to consider could be muscles. So another component on this is muscles. They are actually the allies for survival, and they'll become more tense because they want to protect us. So our muscles always want to protect us. However, the chronic tension actually decreases our nourishment and then the cells by restricting the oxygen carrying the blood to the muscles. So we're not able to do what we usually do because our muscles are so tense through different trauma in different ways that we can't actually function like we're used to functioning anymore. This is similar to our eyes when there is chronic tension even in our eyes, because for whatever reason that's connected to the trauma that we've been exposed to, it can lead to abnormal vision. Our ears, our vocal cords attend to the meaning of words, as well as pitch, the loudness, the rhythm, and that's our clues for safety. So when the different volumes change, then our alert systems go off. Due to this, we need to know that those who have experienced trauma, so our kids coming back, they might be a little bit more sensitive to the fluctuations in the voice that we give. So we have to really be in tune with that as educators. And then we talk about like our belly and our heart brains, that those are all connected with our neural systems as well. So simply put, our bellies have a voice that are often trying to communicate something to us. Many times stress and exposure to trauma are reasons for these communications. So it's not simply just because we're hungry, but something might be going on in our stomachs that is trying to communicate. So we might have upset stomachs because something has happened in our past or a traumatic event, and that's leading us to be a little bit more upset and to make us a little bit more nauseous. Something with our hearts or our heart brains, that our hearts actually make oxytocin, which facilitates trusting relationships. So that's how we start trusting other human beings. And we've just talked about the relationship between trust and building relationships with others is really, really important. So ultimately, that trust leads to our implicit memories. So the memories that are kind of just stored with us based on our experiences. When there's a traumatic event, though, those memories aren't met with support. So that implicit memory is then impacted. So there's definitely a lot more interconnections, as you can see, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of an idea of just how connected each part of our bodies are and how much trauma actually impacts our entire self. So our social, emotional, behavioral, and physical well-being each and every day, which we'll talk about even a little bit more with the relational importance. So we all know, as I've kind of discussed, that building relationships is just a foundational thing that we need to meet the needs of all of our students, as they are an integral component to everybody. So everybody needs relationships of some sort. However, it's not easy to build these with students. It's necessary to build them with colleagues. But when there's trauma impacted and people go through some sort of traumatic event, we have to be aware of that, because the way we build those relationships are a little bit different. That's why it's not always easy to build relationships with students. They might be closed off for whatever reason. And that's the same thing with our colleagues too. So not all of our relationships will be the same with colleagues. They won't all be the same with students, but there is a need for the connectivity nonetheless. This is anywhere from accessing resources to understanding the values, ethics, beliefs of others, just really getting to know them. We have to understand that just different things are developed early on, and that's really, really important when we start building these relationships. And part of this awareness and development is actually understanding how to identify the trauma. And Laura will kind of explain a few more ways of how to identify trauma as educators.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've heard on multiple occasions when I've talked with my colleagues about this is I've heard teachers say, I'm not a trained mental health provider. I don't know how to identify this. I'm just a teacher. I'm not a mental health provider. I don't have skill in this. I have so much else to worry on. I know it's really important, but I don't know how to diagnose trauma. I don't know how to do that. And I think one of the important things to remember, and as Casey and I were preparing this, we wanted to talk about this, is you are not required to be, as an educator, a trauma detective. You don't have to go hunt it out, seek it out, find every single underlying trauma that is in there. We want to have trauma-informed approaches so that even if we don't know what's happened, we're in a safe and supportive environment for students. And so it is the role of teachers to support students in that socially appropriate way, their emotional needs, their behavior needs, and their academic ways. And teachers are amazing at this. You do this every day, you work hard at this, but sometimes it's hard to look past when there are those other things going on. How do we get there? And so I like this part in here that says this is kind of the look for. So you're the person who can spot trauma or maybe the signs of it, so that then we can refer on to somebody else. And so that learn the signs and observe changes in behaviors, that's the relational part that Casey was just talking about. And how do we make sure we know our students? We're able to know signs of trauma. We'll talk about those here in just a little bit. and some changes in our behaviors of our students. When you build relationships with students, you know when a student has now had a shift in their behavior. Things look very different than they do before. And that's what happens when we have that relationship. We're able to identify that earlier so we can meet that need. And one of the greatest things I see teachers do is they help students overcome their fears. When you have that relationship, you know them, you build that, they have trust in you. So when you help them through that, you help them learn, you help them with a growth mindset, all of that, you're able to help them overcome their fears, which is good. And that knowing where to turn is that last part of, you don't have to be everything to every student. We have some mental health providers within our schools. You have school psychologists, school counselors, LMHPs. Many of our schools have access to that, or community providers. We have some great in that. And they're the experts in providing that direct service and can help dive down more. But we just need to know who we can turn to if it's more than what we can traditionally handle within our environments. And so I think that's an exciting thing that we have. But what are the look fors? And so this on your screen right now, you see this list, and this came from the Department of Health and Human Services in Illinois, and they did a great job of breaking down ideas of different things that you can recognize. So if you look at this right now, how many of these things can you as a teacher recognize pretty quickly? You're going to see irritability. You're going to notice they're now starting to startle easy. Or even if this is a new student, you can see that when you get close to them, their body gets tense. Kids are fussier than normal, frequent tantrums. All of these things are happening. But throughout all of these, our relationships are just center. We have to know, is that clinginess just because they're really, really, really shy? Is that something that is just normal for them, or is this something new? Is there something else that's happened in their world, and how can we identify that? So typically experiencing one of those incidents that we talked about earlier of the causes of trauma aren't going to be long-term and embedded trauma, but it might cause short-term, and now is when we wrap around those supports for kids to be able to make it that short-term that we can get that support.
Yeah, so definitely we kind of just figure through that and figure out how do we best support our students. Definitely really, really important for that. It's also important to understand some trauma intersectionalities. So know that trauma that just impacts different people in different ways. So not only what do we look out for, and as we keep bringing up how essential it is to have relationships built with students and families and community members to be able to do this effectively. Part of doing so is to understand that cultural identity might play a part in how someone is affected by trauma. This is also a major component in building the relationships, because we become more culturally responsive when we know the unique cultural identity of each student. But it can't stop at awareness, and I think that's really important to understand. Cultural responsiveness is not just an awareness of a different culture. We need to start embedding the different identities into the district, into the school, and into the classrooms through really, really strong family partnerships. So looking into the family and community partnerships and what do these look like? When we work with families and build the relationships with them, we're more likely to ensure the social, the emotional, the behavioral, the academic, the physical needs of each student are being met all the time. We can do this through culturally responsive approaches. We can, which will ultimately reduce our barriers that we have with the community, with families. It helps people to overcome a stigma that might be placed on certain individuals for various reasons based on their identity factors. It does address social adversities. It can strengthen family partnerships. It can encourage positive ethnic identity. So a lot of really good stuff can come out of ensuring that we're meeting the needs of our learners as well as the community in a culturally responsive manner. However, in order for this to be really effective, we need to really get it deeply implemented, and it needs to be across many service sectors. So we need to think of communities, organizations, educational systems, the neighborhoods, families, and individuals. This begins with inviting community into the school, as well as the school going out into the community. So a lot of times I've seen school districts do really, really good job at inviting in, but there's less about the school actually going out in the community and doing some different things with different community members, with different organizations. And that's an important part of the partnerships. And that allows school systems to actually get to know the community a little bit better so they can be more culturally responsive in nature. And then it kind of digs down into just knowing family dynamics within your school and how those intersectionalities work together. And then very specifically building, as we keep saying over and over, the individual relationships with students, with parents, and with different community members. And when all of this tends to occur and it works out really well, we can move towards what the notion of radical inclusiveness. So this is just something that really comes out of the text of the heart of trauma. And of course, we all want to say we're inclusive. I think this is a word that gets thrown around quite a bit, that of course we're an inclusive school setting, but what does this radical inclusiveness mean when we are working with communities, with families, and with students? So specifically when we think about trauma, does that change anything? Well, the notion of radical inclusiveness is that everyone is welcome here. This means they are truly welcome without judgment and without a requirement to change. So we're not asking them to change a component of their identity. We're not asking them to change any piece of who they are. We are just saying come and welcome. We need to recognize we might have bias, like we discussed last week. There might be some bias, some prejudice, some stereotypes within us as human beings. So we need to make sure we're addressing that and ensure that it's not affecting our commitment to radically include everybody that comes into the school. So when you're thinking, and there's no response required here, but I kind of want you guys to just think a little bit. Think of your buildings. So when you're going to walk into your building as early as next week, and some of you have already been preparing classrooms, what are the physical components? What does it look like? How does it feel when you walk in based on the looks? Do you think it has a welcome feeling for the community and family it serves? So are there pieces of the cultural identities of the community as a whole? Is that included within the school building itself? Are there any changes that could be made to make it a little bit more inclusive of the community that's being served? So thinking upon returning, what is a school district to allow the sense of inclusiveness, yet working to keep everyone safe and aligned with health measures? So I think that is a big component right now, is we're not going to allow a lot of people to come into the buildings because there's a health concern. So what are we doing as districts to making sure that we still feel like they're included as part of the school system? So those are just some things to kind of think about. Is there anything else that can be done? Are there any online tools? Are there any social media tools that could be utilized a little bit more readily during this time? This leads up to the next point. The greater the wounding, the more numerous the powerful protectors need to be, as they are indispensable to people's functioning. So I think that's just a really powerful statement. So how will we be ensuring this is the case this school year? Who are the numerous and powerful protectors for our staff? Who are they for our students? Who are they for our communities? So just kind of thinking about some of those things. And then also thinking that radical inclusiveness is intellectual compassion as well. So this is how we understand how family history has flowed downstream, which is how whole cultures are carried forward. What are the ways that we learn about families? So as your educational system in your district, start thinking about how do you learn about the families, the students. Of course, this is not the end of it. It can be so much more. But the key is, however, knowing communities, knowing families, knowing students, so we are just able to best meet their needs. Specifically, if they have been exposed to trauma, this can assist us in knowing how to best work with them as well. So like Laura was saying, and we've said earlier, building of that relationship is really, really important to be able to work with the students, to be able to identify different factors that are happening of what might be different in their behavior based on that. So once we do know a little bit more or have an idea of trauma exposure, there are some ways to learn about the impact. So Laura will share some of that insight about the actual trauma screening.
And so at Nebraska NeMTSS, if you've been on many sessions with us, we talk a lot about database decision making and wanting to know. And so in a lot of our other content areas that we talk about, this means screening. It's universal screening. It's figuring that out. And when we talk about trauma screening, we want to give some caution on that, and really looking at making a decision as a team to decide, is this something that we really want to jump into? And not because we want to ignore that trauma is happening or that we would deny that any of the students and staff within our building have been through it. But there's still some questions out there about trauma screening and whether that's what we should do, if it's evidence-based. And so talk a little bit about that. But what we do know about it is it's not something that we want to do as an individual staff member. So as all of my classroom, I'm going to sit down and do this screening. And so that's not what it is, its function would be. It would be something that a district leadership team would want to look at and as a team decide, is this something that we really want to do? And there may be really valid reasons for you as a team to identify students, and you might have the resources to be able to do the screening tool and provide the services. So you would sit down and look out, do we have the cost to be able to do that? Do we have a support staff who can provide the support we need after we would identify our students in trauma? Are our staff trained well enough to be able to do that? Do we have our infrastructure built well enough to be able to truly do that? And we also want to make sure it is in line with the other screening tools that we have. So as a district, you do a lot of screening of kids. You might already have some behavioral screenings, some social emotional screenings. What does that look like? And are we screening too many times? Do we have too much data that we're not actually analyzing? We're just saying, hey, we've checked this box for getting that. Just things to think about in there. We also know that when we think about trauma screening, we really do need to have guardian consent. They need to likely need to be aware that this is happening for their child, especially if you're going to be recommending some changes. There might be some feelings that are drummed up just through those, if you use something that's in an interview sort of a format, any of that, we have to make sure we have it. And I think the point about, as a district, be prepared to use data is one of the most important pieces on this screen and that we'll talk about, is because we don't want to just collect something to then say, yep, we've got a bunch of kids who've experienced trauma in our school. We knew it. Like, that's it. We have to be prepared and have an action plan. And later on in this time, Casey's going to talk about trauma-informed schools and what that looks like in our trauma-informed practices. And we really want to make sure those are in place before we would look at doing any sort of a screening. But that community partnership is really, really important. As was talked about last week, and as Casey just mentioned, we really have to know the relationship with our community, not just the mental health providers, but maybe it's a tribal group, maybe it's a cultural group. The whole community will be aware, because kids are going to talk. If you've done this screening, families are going to talk about this, and we need to have a shared understanding of why we're doing this within our school. And so on this next slide here, there are several screeners that are out there and available, and these are good screeners that are out there. We wanted you to be aware of this. You do have access to our slide deck in the resources handout that's been shared out in the link here. But you'll see on here they vary. They vary in length from 10 items, which then expands to 54 items, 48 items. So they vary in length. This would be something your leadership team would look through and say, okay, this is what fits our needs. They talk about the different areas that they measure. And in looking at tools, it's really important, if you do decide to do trauma screening, that you know your purpose for screening, and then find the tool that is most appropriate for that. Some cautions that we want to put out there is, one, that it's relatively new. And so there aren't a lot of studies demonstrating evidence for the use of this in schools. We're not saying it's not, but right now there's just not a lot out there. So it's new, and we want to make sure you're aware of that. But one of the really difficult parts with this is that what's going to be screened. And so we're talking about trauma as the individual's response to those adverse and overwhelming conditions rather than the experience itself. So if we're just saying that the experience itself happened and we're measuring that, that's different from the child actually experiencing trauma from that event. And so there's some subjectivity within that, which makes it difficult for it to be a reliable measure in that. And so we know that all kids will be going through the same event. We have to be careful with that, because the measurement of large groups is sometimes challenging and unwieldy. And so within that screening process, it's difficult. If you're looking at screening your whole school district for it, it might be difficult. We also know that there's not a diagnosis for having multiple things that are going on related to trauma and multiple symptoms within that. So it just might cause some more confusion and adverse experiences for those individuals. And there's another part of it that parents and children, they historically don't have there's not a lot of agreement on the reporting of a child reporting their experiences with adversity and trauma and a parent reporting that. And some of those tools look at that too. So those are some of the things that are difficult, but I think it's also important to know it's difficult for us to then identify what supports the school is going to give based upon the results of that screener. And so those are some cautions that we really just think that you should have when you're out there. And I like this quotation. I'm going to read it word for word. I don't usually read every word on my slide, but I'm going to do this one because I think it's important. A common reaction to whole staff presentation is a notion that trauma sensitivity requires screening and identifying all children who've had traumatic experiences. In fact, this is not recommended and could be quite harmful. In addition to stigmatizing some children, this approach also reinforces the idea that trauma sensitivity is solely about applying interventions to particular children instead of creating a safe environment for all children. So I think this is the greatest segue as we talk about it's not just about interventions. We're talking whole child here. We're talking what is for all. And so Casey's going to share with us about some trauma-informed practices in schools.
Yes, absolutely. So trauma-informed schools, as Laura was saying, it doesn't have to be labeled anything, that we really can just do really, really good work through trauma-informed schools. They really just look to recognize that many problematic student behaviors reflect a developmental response to their experiences. And it's not always that they're trying to be willfully or purposefully misbehaving. It's just something that it just happens and it triggers in them. It could be from traumatic experiences that they've had in their past. And their neural pathways have changed. So we just need to be really cognizant of that. So what happens within trauma-informed schools really is we start going from asking what is wrong with you as a student. So we're not just putting all blame on the student and trying to make them figure out what's wrong with them, or telling them that something is wrong with them, or telling them that they even need to be fixed, or they're not doing it correctly, to what happened to you. So changing it, it's a whole paradigm shift. It's changing our mindsets and not saying what is wrong with you. We're starting to ask what happened to you, which just allows us to better understand, build a relationship a little bit more, and it allows us to restore relationships instead of continuing to divide and stopping relationships. With this, adults then assumed that there's a shared awareness and sensitivity to potential impact of trauma and adverse experiences on students' lives. So knowing that trauma does actually impact the students, and so our adults are really trying to build and forge the relationships with our students, knowing that there's an adverse impact, and they're trying to figure out what that is and how to best help them. Again, it's a paradigm shift for many educational systems, and it's okay to say that there are several components to consider. And because there are so many components to consider, we know that it really does take some time. So some of the different components that we want to just kind of briefly go over are being able to identify and assess traumatic stress. So again, not going back to all the screeners, but just looking at student behaviors like Laura was saying earlier, and what are some of those changes? So when we look at the LOOK acronym, what are some of the changes that are happening within individual students, with specific students, and how do we help them then? We're addressing and treating the stress. We're looking into different education and awareness opportunities. We're actually, like I've talked about earlier, we're partnering with students and families to make sure we know they're getting all of their needs met, to get a better understanding of their background, a better understanding of what trauma that they might have been exposed to. We're creating an environment for them, and this is a really key component. And we talk over and over within our NeMTSS frameworks that the environment is incredibly essential for educational systems and for students and for staff to feel welcome, to feel like they belong, and to feel comfortable where they are. Again, cultural responsiveness is key. We need to understand that it is not only students that we need to care for, but it's staff self-care. We've talked a lot about adult self-care and understanding that that's a key component to all of this. We need to look at school and discipline policies and practices. I think this is one where schools tend to miss out on the opportunity to move towards more trauma-informed schools and educational systems. And then we just need to keep collaborating with different community partnerships and understanding what's happening in the community and how does that influence and impact educational systems, and then vice versa to that. So this is never to say all of this is going to happen at one time, because it simply won't and it can't. These are just areas for leadership teams to look into, to consider, to start getting an idea of what is going well in the school and what is not, what needs to be worked more towards in a very strategic manner, to ensure that these things, when they do start occurring and when you do start implementing them, that they're implemented with fidelity. So with that said, these components are quite restorative in nature. Kind of digging into those different trauma-informed approaches then, restorative approaches are used for trauma-informed approaches instead of punitive punishment. So that's a really key component of this, is trauma-informed is not punitive. So we got to understand that first. Districts should not consider this as just another thing. It should be embedded in everything that is done through a systematically tiered approach. There needs to be shared leadership. There needs to be, so these big components and the essential items of MTSS, the shared leadership, the collaboration, partnerships, evidence-based practices, the infrastructure for implementation, layered continuum of supports, and problem solving. So as you see on the right, there's with the bookshelf. So this is actually a concept shared by Kimberly Breen out of Chicago. We have to understand that we're not putting students who are struggling socially, emotionally, behaviorally within the bookshelf. It's not students that go in the bookshelf. It's the resources, it's the strategies, it's the tools, it's the approaches to help guide and foster and ensure we're meeting the needs of all of our students. So now kind of considering what trauma-informed approaches are and having learned a little bit more about that, we'll focus a little bit on different levels districts might be at. So looking at the slide, as I kind of go through the different types and the different levels of trauma-informed schools, I would want you to kind of consider putting in the chat, if you're comfortable with it, which one you think best describes the environment you work. So is it trauma-inducing, trauma-indifferent, trauma-informed, or trauma-invested? So think of trauma-inducing is setting, it's an environment that lacks safety and is actively unsafe. The setting tends to highlight the deficits and problems. And then you go into a trauma-indifferent, which does not account for childhood trauma and its practices and policies. Academics are separate from SEL practices. So that would probably be a school that MTSS is not well embedded in. And then you go into trauma-informed. It's a setting where stakeholders have some knowledge about childhood trauma. They've practiced related strategies, so they're aware, they kind of understand. Social emotional practices are incorporated within academics. And then you go to trauma-invested, is a setting where stakeholders act on their knowledge and work together to enhance safety. So there'll be the whole learning. So this is when your MTSS process, it includes a trauma-informed care system, and it's actually looking at the whole child. So if you feel a little comfortable, we have some coming in, some indifferent, indifferent. So that kind of seems to be a pretty common one right now, is it's trauma indifferent. So kind of at that beginning stages, maybe, and even trauma indifferent can possibly, you've thought about it at least, or you've considered it, but you're not accounting for it, which is fine. There's always a beginning point. So kind of thinking about that, how can we move more into a trauma invested school? Laura is going to begin talking a little bit more in depth about restorative practices, which can be the bridge to trauma-informed care.
All right. Thanks, Casey. So restorative practices, this is not a new concept. This has been around for hundreds of years. The roots of restorative practices actually goes to multiple indigenous people, countries from North America, Africa, Australia. Like this has been around for a while. And the fundamental intent of it is that human beings are happier and more cooperative and productive when you do things together rather than from having authority do things to you. Like when you say it like that, it doesn't feel like that shocking of an idea, right? Like we don't like to just be told how to do that. We like to be a part of the conversation. And restorative practices really does focus on that, of bringing the individual into the group and having it, we talk about things together rather than at. And one of the great conversations I was listening into a session about PBIS, and they were talking about restorative practices in it. And one of the conversations is in order to implement restorative practices within our schools, first we have to have those proactive approaches for us to be able to build relationships. And so I guess, I don't know, if you guys got $1 for every time that Casey and I talked about building relationships, you would be very rich right now, I guess. But we're going to keep talking about it because it is so important. And so our restorative practices really are multi-tiered. And so we're going to show you the continuum later of restorative practices, but it really does emphasize the importance of the relational needs while still focusing on student accountability for behavior. And so I think that's one of the great things in this is that we do focus on student behavior and how that impacts others, but we do that in a positive way rather than a punitive way. And restorative practices, so I really like this graphic when we talk about why do we even need to think about having restorative practices in our school? Is this just another fad? Is this just something else that is coming out that we should just do? And really what we should know is through restorative practices, members of the school community, one, they're going to be able to address the needs of the school community because everyone has a voice and they are able to be heard. Everyone has a role within the restorative practice. There's not somebody who's just telling everyone how it has to go. We all have a meaningful role. So because of that, we're able to feel safe and feel like our needs are met and we're valued in our opinion in that. It also allows building healthy relationships between students and educators because we build upon those positive personal relationships in the school community. And we also recognize that everyone in our school community can be a positive contributing member of the school, of the group. And so by recognizing and honoring that everyone has a role really does empower individuals to feel ownership and feel acceptance of whatever decision is made and how that works. There's that ownership of it. Restorative practices do help reduce, prevent, and improve the behavior because through the practices and through some of the more intensive services, it's recognizing a person's role in maintaining that safe school environment. We talk about it. We talk about what specifically it was. So the individual who was there knows what's expected of them and how they can do better, but they also understand the impact of their behavior on others. Really thinking about that school community and how that impacts each other. Building empathy is so important, and that's a skill I know we talk about lifelong skills. Whenever you talk about what do you want students to leave with, empathy is one of those skills that we talk about, and so we're able to do that. Restorative practices can help resolve conflict. And so we're learning to take responsibility, not an easy task for anybody, whether you are 2, 22, 72, it's not always an easy thing for us to do to take responsibility for our behavior. But when we're in a safe environment and we've set this up as a positive experience, we're more able to build on that and resolve that conflict. And then another really great component of restorative practices is it can help restore relationships and repair harm. There are things that have happened within our schools. There are traumatic experiences our kids have been through. There are some events that we have to work through that are not pleasant experiences, and relationships get damaged. It happens. We can't avoid it. But through restorative practices, there's a structure of a way that we can build that back so that we can work together and really help repair those relationships. Because we know, again, it all comes back to that relationship. And once we see within this cycle that they really are cared for in this and they have a voice, it helps keep that relationship positive. So this is a kind of a graphic that I think is really a neat one, and this one is adapted. So the International Institute for Restorative Practice, if you're interested in restorative practices, I encourage you to look out there. They have some great modules training on this, but this is one of the things that we talk about is the social discipline window. And so it's this concept, it applies to a variety of settings. We're going to talk about it here in school settings, but I would guess that you can apply this to other settings of your life. And so we see these 4 domains listed on here in the quadrants. And we see down here along the bottom, this is the support that the individual, the adult, would be giving to the student. And then up on the side here is the control that that adult or the individual has over that scenario. And so over here in this neglectful stage, when we're at we're very low support and very low control, we just aren't going to do anything, and we just hope that eventually the kids are going to stop doing what they're doing. We're just kind of ignoring, sitting back, and not in that. Obviously, that's not where we want to live. That's not where we want to do, but that is that quadrant of it. Our punitive segment over here, this is where we have high control. We are making sure we are punishment. We are doing something to that kid who is misbehaving or to that staff member who didn't do what they were supposed to. We're in that. They might give detention. The extreme of this one is zero tolerance. There's no support involved in this. Zero tolerance, would be like up here in the top corner over here with no support, and high that. It does not, zero tolerance does not jive with restorative practices. It's not on there. This is where you think back when we talked about embedded trauma or just the one time, there is no support for kids in this part of it. So just think about that. Now over here, we've got permissive. And so, we're not really going to hold you too much. We do things maybe for kids. We accept excuses saying, you know what? They've been through so much trauma. Do you know all of these things that they have going on in their world? We just can't. Or they have a disability or any of those kinds of things. We might tell them they're just, they have a hard time making friends, so they're just working through that. I'm not going to address that behavior right then. And we've all seen in these types of classrooms, the kids love these teachers. They love this sort of a scenario. But what happens is the other kids start to figure it out. And then this becomes like this snowball of permissiveness, and things keep happening. And then we get stressed out as the individual if you try to add control, any sort of control into that, it doesn't really work as well. And so where we want to get, and where we talk about restorative practices, is up in this top right corner where we are with them. And so the goal there is to work with the student to resolve the issue. So the teacher and student would talk one-on-one, explain the behavior. And again, we're doing this quietly, not calling them out, yelling at them in front of class, but we're talking it through it in a relationship way. We want to make sure there's that communication. And maybe we're finding some of those questions that Casey was talking earlier, finding out the why, what's happening with them, listening to, are they struggling with making friends? Do I need to help them build some skills? How can we facilitate that? But within this, when those behaviors are happening, we're still holding them accountable and supporting them to that. But we are there with them to support and figure out, okay, I'm here for you. We got this. We are going to work together to get through that. And so I think for me, this was a great graphic of where we want to be with restorative practices to do that. And so Casey's going to talk a little bit now more about some of the processes in an environment for success.
Yeah, so like Laura was saying, with restorative, we want to be with the students. So part of being with the students is really through engagement, through explanation, through expectation, clarity. I think a lot of people, when they hear restorative practices, they think, well, that's just either a lot of fluff, or that really doesn't work, or we're not allowing kids to be held accountable anymore because it's not punitive in nature. So I think that's when it's done very incorrectly. When it's done correctly, we can go through what's called a fair process, and we're engaging students. So we're with them, and we're involved in the different decisions, and they're involved with the decisions as well that affect them. We're listening to their views, and we're actually not just hearing them, but listening to them and taking into an account of what their opinions might have been during any sort of behavior that they might have displayed. We're allowing the explanation and the reasoning behind everything to occur. So the adult or the student, why did this happen? And we're allowing that dialogue to occur through an explanation component. We're still expecting clarity. So we're making sure everybody clearly understands a decision and what is expected of them in the future. So it's not just talking them through something and not having an expectation later. It is really setting things up in a proactive way to hopefully alleviate it in the future through that expectation clarity. Really, this fair process is the best way to create an environment for success for students, to allow them to feel like they are part of the problem solving and they are not excluded from the problem solving. I've had discussions with districts that in the punitive way or out of school suspensions, when it's an automatic is what they would say. Well, that in the handbook it said it's an automatic 2 days OSS. That doesn't allow a problem solving process to occur. And if we know social emotional learning, we also know that that's a big component to social emotional learning is critical thinking and problem solving. Through MTSS, critical thinking and problem solving is really important. So we as adults need to model that. And the best way to model that is to be with students during that process, not excluding them from the conversation of what should happen or what could happen, but really engaging, explaining, and expecting clarity in our decision making. So this is a big part. In the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more of shame and the compass of shame, but this FAIR process is a way that students, hopefully it'll alleviate this compass of shame with them. So this is from Nathanson, and it's just developed to illustrate the various ways that human beings react when they feel shame. So we don't want our kids to feel shame, and a lot of times if we're punitive in nature, they tend to feel that way. So it becomes a little bit more internalized. We're not seeing who they are as human beings anymore. We're not looking at their traumatic events that might have happened to them, but instead we're just saying, you did this, you get this, and we're not allowing them to be the human beings that they are. Then they get into this whole compass of shame. So at the top, you'll see that there's a withdrawal. So when they feel shame, they might just withdraw and kind of internalize a lot of stuff. And they might want to just be by themselves more. They might run off and hide. They need that time to themselves because they feel so bad about whatever had happened. Then the next could be attacking themselves. So that it could either be verbal put downs and letting themselves know an internal talk or even an external talk about themselves, just making them feel even worse about who they are, which will ultimately lower their self-esteem too. And there could be avoidance, so just simply denial, the avoidance of sinking into drugs and alcohol. I know some of us also avoid by eating, so we avoid through food, and that's our coping mechanisms from sometimes, but that could also come from shame. Distraction through thrill seeking, so kind of just not safe thrill seeking, but maybe taking it a little overboard. And then another component could be just attacking others. So just that is more of a physical violence or a verbal violence towards other people. So lashing out, blaming the victim, physical aggression, throwing things, destroying classrooms are different ways that you might see this in the educational setting. So it's also important to note here that a lot of this compass of shame stems from zero tolerance. And as Laura nicely said, they don't jive. Zero tolerance and restorative practices, they don't jive together. They simply can't occur at the same time. And we really need to recognize that and know that and be aware of that. So some ways to view how to assist can be through Restorative Practices Continuum, and Laura will dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, so we've told you about the why, the foundation of restorative practices, but you're sitting here thinking, okay, but how do we do this? What does this look like? And so on your screen right now, what you see is the continuum of restorative practices. And so they're not limited to the formal conferences and processes that maybe we've heard about of the circles, and in that, it really is across the continuum. So they range from informal to formal. On a restorative practices continuum, the informal practices, they have affective statements that we communicate feelings, as well as affective questions that cause people to reflect on their own behaviors. And then we have some impromptu or proactive circles and groups, which as we go across, everything gets a little bit more structured as we move through the continuum and we become more formal. And they typically involve more people as a part of it. And so although the formal restorative processes, they have a dramatic impact, our informal practices are cumulative impact because they really are a part of that everyday life and they become just a part of who you are and how your classrooms function. So what we see here we'll start with affective statements. And so this is the starting point. This is the starting point for all of our restorative practices is this non-judgmental, active listening that we must do. We must engage in it. And that non-judgmental part is hard. I know you've talked about bias, we've talked about all those other things. There are other things that we've thought of. We have histories with kids, we have all of this going on. So that's not something, but if we're going to move into true restorative practices, we really want to make sure that we allow for that non-judgmental listening so that students can express their feelings and how things are impacting them, and they can feel that there's that true reciprocation of relationship and that there's that value on what's being said. Without that feeling, there will not be success for restorative practices. And so some of the phrases you see on here, we want to look at observations versus evaluations. So I see something, I'm noticing something, I hear, really helps to see so that the student sees that they're being recognized, that their voice is being heard in it. We want to use feelings versus I thought. So I'm worried, I feel frustrated, I get excited, and helping modeling and giving students these cues as well so that they can start using them and understand how to express what's going on rather than those physical things that we saw maybe on the shame or other areas of acting out. And we look at needs versus rules or directions. So, I'm valuing cooperation. I need some help. I feel safe. I need a safe classroom, talking about what that is. And then really also looking at plans and requests versus demands. So in the future, could we look at that versus you have to do this, you must do this. It's a positive intent. Would you be willing to try this? And in those conversations are really helpful for it. After our next level, so we've maybe done some of those statements, we've modeled it within our classrooms, we might get to a place where we have to engage in a conversation with the student. And so in our questions, we're going to, rather than just have the student be punished, we're going to allow them to think about the behavior and then start to think about how can we make changes to change behavior in the future? Because we don't want to just live in this cycle of the same behaviors happening over and over again. And the goal of restorative practices is to build that so that we reduce behavior. If you remember back to our original thing on there, we talked about reducing those behaviors. So here are some of those questions that we're asking. We're asking what happened, but when we're asking that, we're asking it to hear the student's voice. We're asking it to hear the student's perspective. We're focusing on the timeline. We're focusing on actual events, not our judgments and trying to place blame. Same thing as we're talking with adults in that. We're trying to figure out truly what was going on in there. What were you thinking about the time? Not the, like, as a parent, I'm like, what were you thinking? No, not that kind of what were you thinking, but listening to what was going through your mind, what were you processing, figuring that to see if you can identify the triggers and identify those to be able to understand them and help to be able to work through it. What have your thoughts been since? Developing, we're working on emotional literacy with students, helping them link their thoughts and feelings to the behavior that was occurring and start having this discussion. And students really do, once they have those relationships, they start to engage in these conversations. There's a lot of powerful information that can come out of it. Who has been affected by what happened? We want to work together to figure out what has happened once the emotions are down and the situation has de-escalated. Talk to them about what's been going on, who's affected, and figuring out then what ways have they been affected. So here is, we're trying to trigger the empathy gene that we were just talking about earlier. We're trying to trigger that empathy and maybe some remorse for the situation that occurred in that. And we're thinking beyond those people who are directly involved in the situation, maybe looking at ripple effects in there. We can think about what do you need to do to make things right, having that conversation. And a lot of times they can think of ideas how to do that. And then in the end, what would you do differently? So we want to devise agreed, realistic, meaningful resolutions to heal that harm. realistic is that part in there? We really have to know how that works. And then this is an opportunity for the student and for staff to work on learning and verbalizing some of those alternative strategies. And now Casey's going to share a little bit about circles, kind of moving on that continuum of restorative practices.
Yep, and circles can still be done with all, so it can be a tier 1 approach, it can be a tier 2 or a tier 3 approach, but mainly houses within the all and some approaches to working with students. It's really important within these circles that it's an equal ownership, that the responsibility of power is with everybody, that we're all sitting and you literally sit in the circle and you're working as a team together, and there's no power struggle there. All the members take part in the responsibility. Every single person is given a turn, and we'll kind of get to the different process later and talk about the norms and stuff. And I'll give you examples of how they take turns. The format creates safety, and it creates a lot of expectations. So it definitely, and it gets into building relationships. It builds a relationship and gets students to understand you as the adult, and then other adults that might be part of that circle, but also each other as a class. So it really builds a positive climate within your classroom too. The topic and purpose can evolve once the procedure is established. So many times it's just starting as getting to know you topics, and then sometimes you can go into some really deep ones. I've been part of some suicide restorative circles as well, when that kind of happens in different specific places, or just different deaths within the community. They can be really positive too, different celebrations within the community, which also then ties back to the community and understanding culturally responsive practices as well. So going into the process, so what is the process of circles and what can it do? Just like our team meetings, because the restorative circles can actually be used as problem-solving meetings too. So as a reminder, you always do some norms. So what are the norms? What are some different things that we're going to do every single meeting? Who will be involved? A norm could be, so there's either a talking object, whoever's holding the object is the person who's talking, and that's how it's passed around. How will the next person in line, will it go clockwise, counterclockwise, or will it be voluntary? Also making sure though, part of the norms are everybody is involved. Again, that shared decision making and that shared responsibility. There's different check-ins. How are we checking in to make sure everybody's involved? Again, the different topics can change. It's going to really be dependent on, again, building the relationships, knowing your students, knowing the needs, knowing what's going on within the community, and being able to reach out and figure out what's going on in the community, the different commitments, and then how are we going to, if a student possibly needs to even check out of a circle, how are they going to not participate because something's going on with them a specific day? So allowing that opportunity, and by them checking out is them actually participating too. So it's kind of just important to know the different processes that could occur. So again, this is more for the all and the some. We'll go into something a little bit more for the few, which could be conferences. So thinking of restorative conferences, they're a little bit more intensive. They take a little bit more time, but it still does allow for restoration to occur. It still does allow for communities of care to be developed and to be fostered. A lot of times these restorative conferences are a little bit more scripted in nature because you're really targeting a very specific skill or a lack of skill with specific very few students or individual students. There needs to be a lot of preparation in this. So it just takes a little bit more time because it is more individualized. But hopefully it will end up helping in the end and help with the problem solving process. These restorative conferences usually happen after. So they're a little bit more reactive. So it's after something has happened or after the harm itself. So that's definitely something that can be done. It's very restorative in nature. It ties in a lot of the trauma-informed care. I think the next slide will kind of talk about instead of just jumping to intervening, I think there's a lot of teachers, and I get asked a lot. I have a I work a lot with social, emotional, and behavioral development. So I don't know how to help this kid, or the student is doing this. So I think it's always really, really important to kind of think about these in a restorative nature. Before intervening, we need to reflect as adults first and foremost. Why do we do this work? So why are you here? Is it for the students? Is it for any other reasons? Why is it important to us? So why is the work that we're doing on an everyday basis and working with kids, working in educational systems, working with families in the communities, why is that so important to us? With the student behavior itself, narrowing that down, is it a can't issue or is it a won't issue? So understanding coming from the student, is it because they simply can't do it developmentally, they're not there? So kind of looking into the 4 models of human behavior. Is it developmentally they're not ready to do it, or they don't have the skill sets yet to do it? So the growth mindset, they don't have skill sets yet to do it. Or is it simply just a refusal and they won't do it? So then as an adult, you have to keep reflecting, what assumptions are you making as an attempt to fill these gaps? So what things are going on in your mind, thinking that you should be doing to fill the gap? What assumptions are others making? So if other people have talked to you about the student, what are their assumptions? So this all kind of leads to the bias too. And there tends to be a more bias with students with behaviors than students without, especially students with externalizing behaviors. So start shedding that is really, really important. And then are you looking at the student's unmet need, or are you looking simply at their behavior? So we'll kind of go into what are some of their unmet needs. And essentially we narrow down to there's 3 of them that it could be. As Laura said, if you had $1 every time we talked about relationships, you'd be pretty rich right now. So relationship, is that an unmet need of theirs, which is simply a meaningful connection to another human being? Is it responsibility? So do they not have a sense of self-worth or efficacy or competence? Is that their unmet need? Or is it simply their regulation, their inability to take in stimuli and manage their emotional and behavioral responses according to that stimuli that is coming in? So kind of narrowing it down to these 3, we can then also work through what are some strategies. So we wanted to make sure you had some strategies based on the potential unmet needs that are more restorative in nature, that can be done on a classroom to classroom basis. It does not have to be a school-wide approach. However, we do firmly believe that working through leadership teams are the best ways to develop strong strategies. These are grounded in evidence. So thinking of the relationships. So what you might see are these externalizing behaviors. They might want to be right next to you at all times. To get your attention. They might just come to you all the time. So within any break period they might have, they might be at your desk. They might have dramatic mood swings. So they might go from really happy to really mad to really sad and kind of go back and forth constantly. If they respond well to personal acknowledgement, you know that they're seeking that relationship. And then personal words such as love and hate when they address you, then that could be a relationship piece. So just really quickly, some of those strategies, it's something as simple as a journal prompt might help, getting them to speak more and talk more and build that relationship. The talking circle that we've talked about, just greeting and giving smiles does a world of wonders. A good things huddle, giving each student in your classroom a whisper wish. So what do you wish for them by the end of the school year, or by the end of the week, the month, the day? Listen to them say their name. Many other strategies too, but that just the key point is, what are you doing to connect to and build that relationship with students? So Laura is going to talk about the responsibility.
Yeah, so for our students who are really seeking that, that's their need, is to have that. You're going to see this coming through as they're the ones who are seeking control. They always need to be in control of the conversation or what's happening within the classroom. They're the ones who need predictability, because if you have an adjustment in your schedule, it throws them off. Often we're seeing this as those who are struggling with their relationships with others, and sometimes that is because of their low self-esteem, just that interpersonal between peers. They might only want to talk to adults because they aren't able to work with students as well, or any of those within it. They're escaping tasks and they're figuring out ways, maybe not appropriate ways to escape tasks within the classroom. They're maybe getting somebody else to do stuff for them in that. And again, that comes back to that seeking control and having them do that. And so some really effective strategies that are pretty simple are when giving them responsibility. Giving them specific jobs within your classroom that they can do, having them run something down to the office, being responsible for doing something for our young ones. You are the door, you're the one who closes the door at the end of the line because I need to make sure I have my eyes on you the whole time, but you know that and they have a focus and a purpose in it. But giving them that purpose, it might be the only time they get to be in control of something in their day. So making that a positive experience for them versus them having to negatively seek it is really important. I always love that yet. No, we can't do, we're going to do that later. Yet we aren't doing that yet. And avoiding the word but using and always really helping is really helpful. And that's terminology, I'll tell you, as a parent, I have adjusted that language for myself. And it really does work is rather than saying, no, we're not going to go to grandma and grandpa's house. No, we aren't going out for recess today. We're not going yet. It's not that time. You know the appropriate time that we do that in class. And that comes down to the other one of setting clear expectations, letting them know when that is happening. Another really cool thing for kids who value or who need that responsibility is goal setting and letting them see their progress that they're making is a really effective tool for kids when they're doing that, especially for those who are maybe asking others to complete their tasks. Setting that goal for them of doing it over a length of time and them seeing that success will really help build that self-esteem for them, which is that root cause of what they're needing. So also giving predictability to these kids, helping them know what's coming up. If something's going to change, giving them a heads up. It might just be even that their special jobs, they get to know the heads up that that's going to be coming on, just so that you're kind of letting them in on that, but you know it's going to make your life easier also if they feel comfortable in what's happening within their environment. And then Casey's going to share a little bit on the last section of it, regulation.
Yep, so regulation, that stimuli coming in and out and being able to understand why it is. Sometimes our brains just don't process it. So some basic things of transitions, it's a struggle a lot of times because they don't understand why they have to do that, or if it's a change in schedules or transitions. Really important to note that. There's a lot of fidgeting constantly. I think a lot of people do that. I do that a lot when I'm presenting. I always have a little tool in my hand usually. Escapes or shuts down in challenging situations, and there's a quick trigger. So it's not something that's gradual and we can see progress over time. A lot of times it's just really fast, really quick. And it's hard to determine when that will happen all of the time. There's a lot of an emotional reaction, and then just the processing input, being able to process what's coming in and being dysregulated because of what's coming in. Some really good strategies is a big one is understanding the physical space, and understanding what they need in their physical space to help them. Different seating, weighted pencils, stress balls, the different brain tools, regulation stations if they have the need of needing to be regulated at a specific space. If it can't be done in the classroom, different brain breaks, exercise, lots of different movement. We all need different movement around. Being able to discuss, talk things out with partners, and then really schedule check-ins, especially if a schedule changes, or a schedule might change midday and you've gotten word that we're closing school early. Making sure that you have frequent check-ins during the day will help, because then you can give them updated schedules at that point of time. So just some different strategies when there's that lack of regulation occurring within the students. So what Laura's going to do next is kind of, as we finish today, she's going to sum up some different things with our essential elements.
Yeah, so we always like to bring it back to our shared elements, or these essential elements that we know are part of a system. At the very beginning, when we introduced this, we said this has to be a part of your system. And so when we talk about shared leadership, our team has to be involved. If we are going to be a trauma-informed school and implementing restorative practices, it's important that we have a common understanding of what that is, and an understanding of what we as a district have in moving forward with that, or us as a school building have for our goals in moving forward with that, and how are we going to communicate that with each other? How do we make sure that our community, our partners, all of those that are necessary are involved in that? And so that second essential element is really important. That communication is key so that people understand when they hear restorative practices, if they have like this back history of thinking it's this, like we said earlier, the permissive kids just get away with doing things and we're not going to hold them accountable. There's that conversation. How do we help work with our teachers to understand that? And when we think of restorative practices as an evidence-based part of our system, we know that we have to have the whole part of it. It's not just bits and pieces. It's not just doing that. And do we have other policies or practices in our district that are contradictory that make it so that it's not an effective practice? A zero tolerance policy would be an example of that. Or do we just have to do something? Do we have, a screening process but nothing to go in there? And so what do our evidence-based practices look like there? We know that these, when implemented with fidelity or done well, they really do move the mark. When we have a trauma-informed school, we see those relationships and outcomes for kids really, really move forward, but it has to be done in the way that it needs to be done. We have to make sure we have evidence-based behind it. And that infrastructure, don't just administer a trauma screening to administer a trauma screening. Make sure that we have the supports built in place. Make sure if we're going to say everybody needs to be implementing circles because we think that's a really great part, we're going to move restorative practices, how are we training our staff on that? How are we making sure we have time built into our schedule for that? Which is, they're very important things, but we have to have those conversations because those are the parts that fall off sometimes that make it difficult for implementation, and we do that. And so we talked about our layered, that continuum and all of this, and in the end, it comes down to that database problem solving of are we using circles for our problem solving process? How do we know that this is what we as a building, as a district need, and having those great conversations. So we just want to give you one last refresher of bringing it back together with those elements, because it really does all fit together. It's not meant to be a separate part of it. Our trauma-informed practices really are at the foundation of our tiered system of support. We are at the end of our summer series, which is just wild to think because we have been doing this for, we've been planning it and now we're excited to see it and now it's done. But you are not done with support because we have lots of things to offer you. This first one here on the screen that you see is our virtual NeMTSS Summit. All of the sessions are related to social emotional learning, social emotional behavior. It's all sorts of things. They start next week. Actually, I believe is when we start on that part. It's crazy to think that, right? But we're starting, there are a variety of sessions. You can see the link in there, the NeMTSS Summit. You can register. And thank you, Amy, for putting that that linked registration on there. We encourage you to do that. There are some great speakers that are going to be a part of it. And these individuals here on our screen are also here to help you. So we are the Nebraska MTSS team. Our whole goal is to support schools in your systems, and your ESCs are working through how do we get the best supports possible for our students? How do we build systems of support where kids get what they need within it, and our teachers are supported and our administrators have the tools in their belt to get there? So these are people you can contact any of us. We would be happy to talk with you more about any of the topics, those that we've talked about tonight, those that we've talked about previous times, any other things. We're here for you. That's what we want to do. You'll see some references at the end, but I just want to thank you very much on behalf of the Nebraska MTSS team for all of the time that you've spent on these webinars. We hope you found them useful. We've enjoyed putting them out for you, and you have a great day. Thank you for all your work.